Welcome to our sleep video series, your easiest path to drifting off naturally. These videos are designed to gently guide your mind toward rest. They work in a few simple ways. First, we give your mind something lightly engaging to focus on, not too exciting, not too dull. Just enough to keep your thoughts from wandering, but not enough to keep you awake. Next, through our proprietary neuro-relaxation technique, the pacing of the audio gradually slows as the video progresses. This subtle change encourages your mind to slow with it. The slowdown doesn't happen in a straight line. It follows carefully crafted patterns proven to support deeper relaxation. Finally, every element of the audio is intentionally calm, steady, and pleasantly boring, perfect for helping your mind settle into sleep. Before we begin, I encourage you to subscribe so you always have a new video ready for bedtime. And in return for these videos, we ask just one small favor. Please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're listening from, your city, state, or country, and what time it is for you. It motivates our team, helps us understand what's working, and builds a worldwide community of people who fall asleep together each night. It's always inspiring to see how others use these videos. Now, find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let yourself unwind.
The gears of grief, the high price of Victorian progress. If one were to stand upon the muddy banks of the Thames in the year 1850, peering through the yellow-gray damp shroud, one would hear the heartbeat of the world changing. It was a rhythmic, mechanical thrum, the pounding of steam pistons, the clatter of looms, the screech of iron wheels on iron tracks. This was the sound of the Victorian era, a time when humanity decided, with a hubris that was both magnificent and terrifying, that it could conquer nature through the application of brass, steam, and intellect. But if you listened closer, beneath the roar of the furnaces and the applause of the Royal Society, you would hear a different sound. It was a quieter, more desperate noise. It was the scratching of a quill on a patent application that would never be granted. It was the muttering of a man pacing a cold attic room, talking to machines that refused to work. It was the coughing of lungs filled with chemical dust. It was the silence of the asylum cell. We look back at the Victorian age as a triumph of engineering, a golden age of invention where the modern world was forged in the fires of British, American, and European industry. We celebrate the names that survived: Brunel, Edison, Bell, Morse. But history is a curator that prefers the victors. For every statue erected in a town square to a titan of industry, there are 1,000 unmarked graves filled with men and women who possessed the spark of genius but lacked the fortitude, the funds, or the sanity to survive the inferno of invention. To be an inventor in the 19th century was to enter into a Faustian bargain. It was to volunteer for a war where the enemy was not a foreign army, but the limits of physics, the predation of creditors, and the fragility of one's own mind. It is a story of ruin, and it is that ruin we must examine today, not as a footnote to progress, but as the very fuel that kept the engines running. We must understand the atmosphere of the time to understand the madness. The Victorian era was not merely a chronological period, it was a psychological pressure cooker. The belief in progress, with a capital P, had replaced religious fervor for many. There was a pervasive sense that everything was discoverable, that the world was a clockwork mechanism waiting to be dismantled and reassembled by human hands. This created an environment where the bar for contribution was impossibly high, yet the barrier to entry seemed deceptively low. Any clockmaker, any tinkerer, any bored clergyman could look at a tea kettle and imagine a steam engine. This democratization of ambition was a trap. It lured thousands of souls into the belief that they were one simple mechanism away from fortune and immortality. They did not see that the path of invention was paved with psychological arsenic. Consider the sheer mental isolation of the Victorian inventor. In our modern age, science is a collaborative, institutional affair. We have teams, grants, universities, and peer reviews. The Victorian inventor, however, was often a manifestation of the great man theory, a lone wolf howling at the moon of discovery. They worked in sheds, in basements, in the back rooms of textile mills, guarding their secrets with a paranoia that often blossomed into full-blown delusion. This secrecy was necessary, or so they believed, because the patent laws of the 19th century were a labyrinth designed to destroy the uninitiated. Let us speak of the Patent Office, that great bureaucratic beast that devoured dreams. In England, prior to the reforms later in the century, the cost of obtaining a patent was astronomical, effectively barring the working class from protecting their ideas. An inventor might spend his life savings, his wife's dowry, and the money meant for his children's education just to secure a piece of paper that was often legally worthless if a wealthy manufacturer decided to steal the idea anyway. This financial sword of Damocles hung over every waking moment. The fear of theft bred a toxic paranoia. Men stopped sleeping. They stopped eating. They viewed their neighbors as spies and their friends as potential traitors. This sleep deprivation, coupled with the immense cognitive load of trying to solve complex mechanical problems without the aid of computers or modern calculation tools, created a perfect breeding ground for mental instability. The brain, pushed beyond its endurance, began to fray. Take, for instance, the tragedy of Charles Babbage and his enchanting associate, Ada Lovelace. Babbage, a man of towering intellect, the grandfather of the computer, spent his life consumed by the analytical engine. It was a machine of brass and gears that promised to do the work of the mind. But Babbage was a victim of his own perfectionism and the technological limitations of his era. He was trying to build a jet engine in a blacksmith's shop. The British government poured thousands of pounds into his work, a fortune at the time, only to pull the plug when the results were not immediate. Babbage became a bitter, cantankerous figure, consumed by a sense of persecution. He waged war against street musicians, claiming their noise disrupted his thoughts, a fixation that became a public mockery. He died a man who felt the world had failed him. And Lovelace, the enchantress of number, she saw the poetry in Babbage's gears. She understood the potential of algorithms before the word existed, but she too was ground down by the friction of the era. Plagued by illness, frustrated by the limitations placed on her gender, and driven by a desperate need to fund her scientific interests, she turned to gambling. She thought she could use her mathematical genius to predict horse races. It was the fallacy of the rational mind trying to impose order on chaos. She fell into debt, pawned her family's jewels, and died in agony from cancer at the age of 36, a genius burnt out by the friction of a world not ready for her. But the madness was not always psychological. Often, it was strictly physiological, a poisoning of the blood and brain by the very materials used to create the future. We must remember that the Victorian era was a toxic playground. Safety regulations were non-existent. Inventors and craftsmen worked intimately with substances that we now know to be neurotoxins. The phrase, "mad as a hatter," is not a whimsical Lewis Carroll invention. It is a diagnosis. Hatters used mercury nitrate to cure felt. The mercury vapor was inhaled day after day, settling in the brain, causing tremors, aggressive shifts in personality, and eventual dementia. How many inventors, working on barometers, thermometers, or electrical switches, sat in poorly ventilated rooms boiling mercury? They were literally inhaling insanity. They were dissolving their own neural pathways in the pursuit of a better vacuum pump or a more efficient battery. Consider the vulcanization of rubber. Charles Goodyear, an American whose trials overlap the early Victorian spirit, is the archetype of the suffering inventor. He didn't just want to stabilize rubber, he was obsessed with it. It was a religious calling. He mixed the gum with everything he could find: witch hazel, cream cheese, ink, soup. He boiled it, roasted it, and wore it. He walked around in suits made of rubber that melted in the heat and froze in the cold. He was thrown into debtor's prison multiple times. His family lived in squalor, relying on the charity of friends. He sold his children's school books to buy chemicals. He was poisoning himself with lead and nitric acid, turning his complexion sallow and his body frail. When he finally stumbled upon the process of heating rubber with sulfur, some say by accident, he was a broken man. Even after the discovery, his life was a misery of patent lawsuits. He died owing $200,000, having sacrificed his health, his sanity, and his family's peace for a material that would change the world. The world drove on rubber tires, but the man who made them possible was flattened by the wheel of fortune. Then there is the haunting case of Louis Le Prince, a name that should be as famous as Edison or the Lumiere brothers. Le Prince was a French inventor working in Leeds, England. In 1888, years before Edison showed his kinetoscope, Le Prince filmed moving picture sequences in Leeds, Roundhay Garden scene, and traffic crossing Leeds Bridge. He had done it. He had captured time. He prepared to go to New York to demonstrate his machine and secure his place in history. He boarded a train in Dijon, France in 1890, intending to travel to Paris and then to America. He was never seen again. No body was found. No luggage was recovered. He simply vanished into the ether. Did the pressure of the invention crack his mind, leading to a suicide in some hidden place? Was he murdered by competitors who knew he held the patent to the future of entertainment? Or did the sheer weight of the secret, the paranoia of the inventor, cause him to flee his own life? His family was left in ruin, fighting a losing battle against the Edison monopoly, trying to prove that their father was the true father of cinema. The invention that should have brought glory brought only a void, a mystery that stands as a dark monument to the dangers of being first. The ruin of the Victorian inventor was also accelerated by the ruthless capitalism of the age. The era was dominated by the robber barons, men who understood that it was cheaper to steal an invention or buy a bankrupt inventor's patent for pennies than to fund the R&D themselves. An inventor might spend a decade perfecting a new type of loom. He would mortgage his house, ignore his health, and alienate his friends. When the machine was finally ready, he would lack the capital to manufacture it. He would be forced to approach a financier. The financier, sensing blood in the water, would offer a predatory contract. The inventor, desperate to see his creation live, would sign. Within a year, the inventor would be pushed out of his own company, perhaps retained as a low-level consultant, watching as others grew rich on the fruit of his mind. This theft of agency was a fast track to madness. To conceive of a child, which is what an invention is to its creator, and have it torn from your arms and raised by a stranger is a trauma that breaks the spirit. We see this clearly in the rivalry between Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison, though their conflict spans the late Victorian into the Edwardian era. Edison was the businessman inventor, a man who understood that the invention was the product, but the patent was the weapon. Tesla, on the other hand, was a visionary, a man who spoke with lightning and hallucinated diagrams in the air before his eyes. Tesla's mind was a kaleidoscope of brilliance and compulsion. He suffered from extreme OCD, had a phobia of pearls, and required his dinner napkins to be stacked in specific numbers. As the currents war raged, Tesla was not just fighting for alternating current. He was fighting for a utopian vision where energy was free, where humanity was liberated from drudgery. But the Victorian economic model had no place for free energy. It had no place for a man who cared more about the beauty of the induction motor than the quarterly profit statement. Tesla died alone in a hotel room, penniless, feeding pigeons that he loved more than people, leaving behind trunks of papers that the FBI would seize. He was the ultimate Victorian Icarus, flying so close to the sun of understanding that his wax wings, made of fragile finances and a delicate psyche, melted, plunging him into the sea of obscurity and poverty. Furthermore, we must acknowledge the burden of the almost. For every Goodyear or Tesla, there were thousands of men whose names we will never know, who came this close to the breakthrough. They could see the solution in their minds, but the metallurgy of the 1860s wasn't up to the task, or the chemistry of the 1870s was too unstable. They spent their lives chasing a phantom. This created a specific type of melancholy, a chronic dissatisfaction that rotted the soul. They became the bores of the pub, The men with wild eyes and stained cuffs who would corner you to explain how their perpetual motion machine was only lacking a single frictionless bearing. They were the alchemists of the steam age, trying to transmute base metal into gold, not through magic, but through mechanics. And like the alchemists, they often ended up mad from the fumes and the failure. The social structure of the Victorian era also played a pivotal role in this ruin. It was a rigid society. If a gentleman inventor spent his fortune and went bankrupt, the fall was absolute. There was no safety net. To lose one's money was to lose one's virtue. Bankruptcy was a moral failing, a stain on the character that could not be washed away. The fear of the workhouse, that grim bastion of Victorian punishment for the poor, haunted the dreams of the middle-class inventor. This fear drove them to take greater and greater risks. It was a gambler's fallacy. If I just borrow another £100 for this prototype, I will be rich and all will be forgiven. But the prototype would fail, the boiler would burst, the lever would snap, and the descent would continue. The shame of failure in a society that worshipped success was a heavy stone to carry. It drove men to the bottle, to the opium den, and to the river. We must also consider the sheer physical danger of the machinery itself. The Victorian era was the age of high-pressure steam. Boilers were essentially bombs that people worked next to. An inventor testing a new high-pressure engine was sitting on a powder keg. Explosions were common. Men were scalded, blinded, and maimed. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the giant of Victorian engineering, a man who built railways, bridges, and the greatest ships the world had ever seen, was not immune to this physical and mental toll. He was a man of boundless energy, smoking 40 cigars a day, sleeping 4 hours a night. He was everywhere, checking every rivet, every calculation. But when his massive ship, the Great Eastern, plagued by financial troubles and an explosion during sea trials, proved to be a commercial disaster, the stress was too much. Brunel suffered a stroke and died at 53. He had built the modern world, but the weight of it crushed him. He was a man who could span the Avon Gorge with iron, but could not bridge the gap between his own ambition and the limits of the human body. The intersection of religion and science during this period added another layer of psychological stress. The Victorian era was the time of Darwin, the time when the bedrock of faith was being chipped away by the geological hammer. Inventors were often caught in the middle of this. They were revealing the mechanics of God's universe, and what they found was often indifferent to human suffering. To look too deeply into the machine was to see a universe that ran on laws, not love. For a pious man, this cognitive dissonance could be shattering. If the world is just a machine, then what am I? Just a cog. This existential dread, combined with the isolation and the chemical exposure, pushed many over the edge. Let us not forget the tragedy of the solution looking for a problem. Many Victorian inventors became obsessed with creating devices that were technically marvelous but practically useless. They built elaborate automata, mechanical birds that sang, dolls that could write. These were feats of incredible engineering, requiring years of microscopic focus. But they were toys. The inventor would spend a lifetime perfecting a clockwork duck, only to realize that the world did not need a clockwork duck. The realization that one has wasted one's life on a triviality is a devastating blow to the psyche. It leads to a profound sense of futility, a nihilism that eats away at the will to live. Even the successful ones, the ones who navigated the patent laws, avoided the mercury poisoning, and secured the funding, often found themselves ruined by the success itself. The Victorian public was fickle. They demanded the next wonder, the next miracle. An inventor who had one success was expected to produce another, and another. The pressure to repeat a stroke of genius is a heavy burden. It leads to the sophomore slump writ large. The inventor becomes a slave to his own reputation, terrified of releasing anything less than perfect, eventually releasing nothing at all. They become paralyzed, living in the shadow of their former selves, tormented by the question, was it just luck? In the end, the narrative of the Victorian inventor is a tragedy because it is the story of human reach exceeding human grasp. They were trying to build the 20th century with 19th century tools and 19th century minds. They were pioneers hacking through a jungle of ignorance, and like many pioneers, they succumbed to the fever of the journey. They gave us the light bulb, the telephone, the suspension bridge, and the cinema. But the price they paid was paid in the currency of their own sanity and stability. They were the coal thrown into the furnace of progress, consumed to generate the heat that drove the world forward. When we look at a photograph of a Victorian inventor staring grimly at the camera, hand resting on a strange brass machine, we should not just see a man of science. We should see a martyr. We should see a man standing on the precipice of a new world, looking down into the abyss and feeling the abyss look back. The madness was not an anomaly, it was an occupational hazard. The ruin was not a mistake. It was the expected outcome of daring to challenge the gods of nature with nothing but a slide rule and a dream. As we continue to explore this vast landscape of sorrow and steam, we will delve deeper into the specific mechanics of the patent system that acted as a snare for the unwary. We will examine the specific chemical compound that painted the walls of the asylum. We will read the letters written from debtors' prisons and the frantic diary entries of men who felt their minds slipping away like sand through gears. This is not merely a history of technology. It is a history of the human cost of the modern world. It is a long, dark, and winding road, paved with good intentions and broken glass, and we have only just taken the first step. To understand the depth of this ruin, we must look at the microhistories, the local legends of mad inventors that populated almost every industrial town in Britain and America. Every village had one, a man who had neglected his trade, his farm, or his shop to build a perpetual motion machine in his barn. These men were often objects of ridicule, the village idiots of the industrial age, but their tragedy is profound. They were infected by the spirit of the age, the belief that a single idea could lift them out of poverty and into the pantheon of heroes. They were victims of the great lie of the Victorian era, that merit and ingenuity were enough. They were not. Without capital, without connections, without the ruthless streak needed to crush competitors, ingenuity was just a fancy way to starve. The social isolation of these local inventors cannot be overstated. They became estranged from their communities, viewed as shirkers who refused to do honest work. Their families often bore the brunt of this ostracization. To be the wife of a mad inventor was to live a life of constant apology and financial terror. Furthermore, the speed of change rendered inventions obsolete before they were even finished. A man might spend 5 years perfecting a new type of steam valve, only to find that while he was working, the entire industry had shifted to a different pressure standard or a different mechanism entirely. His life's work was rendered junk metal in an instant. This obsolescence was a psychological hammer blow. It reinforced the feeling of being out of time, of running a race where the finish line kept moving. The Victorian era was the first time in history where the pace of technological change outstripped the human lifespan. In previous eras, a man lived in a world that looked largely the same as the one his grandfather lived in. The Victorian man lived in a world that changed every decade. This acceleration caused a kind of future shock that destabilized the mind. The inventor, who was the agent of this change, was also its primary victim. He was trying to surf a tidal wave, and inevitably most were crushed by the water. Let us consider the aesthetic of the Victorian invention itself, the complexity, the ornamentation. A Victorian machine was not just a machine, it was a cathedral of iron. This desire to make machines beautiful, to make them reflect the glory of the Creator, added an unnecessary layer of difficulty and cost. An inventor wouldn't just build a lathe, he would build a lathe with scrollwork and pinstriping. This obsession with form as well as function was a symptom of the era's romanticism, but it was also a drain on resources. It was a manifestation of the inventor's ego, his desire to be seen as an artist as well as an engineer. When the machine failed, it was not just a mechanical failure, it was an artistic rejection. It was a rejection of the inventor's soul. The ruin was also found in the courts. The Victorian era was a litigious one. The patent troll is not a modern invention. There were companies that existed solely to buy up vague patents and sue anyone who tried to make anything. Inventors who actually made things were bled dry by legal fees. The case of Goodyear v. Day involved Daniel Webster, the most famous orator in America, arguing for Goodyear. It was a spectacle, but for Goodyear it was torture. He had to sit and listen to lawyers dissect his life, question his sanity, and belittle his suffering. The courtroom was a theater of cruelty where the inventor was stripped naked before the public. Win or lose, the process left scars. It drained the joy out of creation. It turned the act of invention from a joyous discovery into a defensive war. As we proceed, we will look at the specific psychological diagnoses of the time, neurasthenia, hysteria, melancholia, and how they were applied to the creative class. We will see that madness was often a label applied to anyone who refused to conform to the rigid social norms of the day. Was the inventor truly mad, or was he just hyper-focused? Was he delusional, or was he just seeing a future that others couldn't grasp? The line between visionary and lunatic is often just a matter of timing. The man who talks to people who aren't there is mad. The man who talks to people who aren't there into a telephone is a genius. The Victorian inventor lived on that razor's edge. So settle in. We have miles to go before we sleep. We have to traverse the smoky alleys of London, the frantic patent offices of Washington, D.C., the lonely laboratories of Paris, and the cold, hard ground of the potter's field. We will bear witness to the sorrow of the men who built the gears that turn the world. This is the autopsy of the Victorian mind, a study in the brilliance and the breakage of the human spirit in the age of steam. And so let's dig deeper into the inventor of the computer. The engine and the silence. On certain winter evenings in London, when the fog brings its own soft weight and the gaslight smears itself along the edges of the street, a man can hear the city think. It thinks in clatters and in trains, in the rasp of iron, in sums that never quite balance. It thinks in engines, which is to say it thinks in dreams made of brass. On one such evening, Charles Babbage stands at his window and listens to the thinking city, and decides, not for the first time, that thinking ought to be improved. The world in its current method is too noisy. It makes careless mistakes. It miscopies tables. It wakes him with barrel organs under his window when he is measuring the teeth of a gear against the patience of a lifetime. The city thinks like a drunk clerk. It needs a better clerk. He turns from the window and returns to the bench, to the sketch that has taken months to reach this simplicity, which is of course a deceit. 1,000 days live under the ease of a correct line, 1,000 little funerals for arrangements that did not function, or functioned poorly. He lays his hand on the paper, just so, to hold down the curl, and the hand is a little tremulous, because this is the hand of a man who has tried to build a machine larger than the habits of his time. He remembers the other winter, the first one at Cambridge when the river froze thin as a schedule, and he and Herschel walked the backs talking of calculus like it was a contested province to be liberated. The Analytical Society was a mischief with a solemn face. They wrote as if they were senators, but they were really insurgents, and like all insurgents they were full of delight. There is a particular joy in believing that if things are wrong it is only for lack of a proper diagram. He believes it still. The diagram is the mercy. He has been merciless in pursuit of it. The difference engine begins, as most salvations do, with irritation. The tables are wrong. They are wrong because they are written by men who must copy and copy again, because the world is large and a hand is small. They are wrong because of tiredness and cheap candles and hunger and the ordinary mischief of fatigue. He holds a printed page and takes a breath, and it is not just a breath. It is the entering of the room of the future and asking if anyone is home. If figures may be calculated by method, and the method may be embodied, then the figures may be freed from the hands that ruin them, freed from their own human keepers. The city will think better. Ships will not wreck themselves upon a misprinted longitude. The universe, for once, will not be embarrassed by the clerical errors of the ape that inhabits it. He writes to those who must be written to. He speaks to those who may be persuaded. There is, he knows, a narrow corridor by which a machine passes from ridicule to funding. He enters it with a certain aristocratic impatience that he mistakes for natural right. That is the first madness, perhaps, not the fever of seeing gears turn under the skin of the mind, but the conviction that the world will bless a man who brings it a miracle. The world is busy. It prefers its old errors to new angels. He finds this out slowly, which is to say too fast. For a while, however, an interval small enough to live in, they listen. They give him rooms and funds and the attention that is oxygen to a certain type of intelligence. He hires Clement, a craftsman whose hands have argued with metal more than any politician has argued with sense. The workshop fills with parts that look like a crossword puzzle exploded and never apologized. He goes home with filings in his hair and the knuckles of his jacket powdered with the ghost of steel. He sleeps in pieces and wakes in pieces, and the pieces sometimes fit together, and when they do, the day is a triumph. If you have never watched an idea discover its own legs, you cannot appreciate the ache of astonishment that accompanies the first steps. What he has in mind is humility disguised as audacity, a machine that will serve. It will not compose sonnets or play chess with God. It will calculate and not tire. It will be loyal to the method, which is the same as being loyal to truth. He makes it beautiful in the way that compulsion always makes things beautiful, by removing everything that does not function, and then polishing what remains until even necessity gleams. But the world demands proofs more quickly than brass allows. He drafts. He calls on ministers who nod in the way of men who have no intention of remembering your name, except to give it to their secretaries with the instruction that future requests from this person be neglected with courtesy. He watches the ledger. He confesses this much. The ledger begins to watch him. There is a year that unthreads itself like a hem. His father dies. A child dies. His wife is taken, and the house fills with a different sort of silence, which is not the good silence of a workshop measuring itself against the patience of iron, but the bad silence of rooms that have lost their meaning. He travels because that is what a man does when rooms become uninhabitable. He returns because what else can he do? The machine sits where he left it. It has not betrayed him. It has not changed its mind. If he continues, then what he has lost will be added to the equity of the future, and the loss will be redeemed in that unearthly currency called utility. A mind like his cannot grieve without hunting for a ledger to place it in. By the time Ada enters, he is already a little shrine in which a fire burns. She brings wind. She calls herself an enchantress because she cannot bear for the world to be only a machine. He calls himself an engineer because he cannot bear for the world to be only an enchantment. On evenings when their differences align, they stand in the same room and look through the same window. Her understanding is that a machine is a language. His understanding is that a machine is a sentence that cannot be misread. Between those understandings runs a bridge that was not yet invented. She speaks of patterns and he hears discipline, and the conversation is a long one, joyful and sometimes unaware of the way death watches curious people with a certain indulgent impatience. He moves to the larger vision like a climber who, halfway up a mountain, notices the higher mountain behind the fog. The analytical engine is the new mountain. Here the method is not simply to compute, but to be permitted to compute anything that can be compelled to obey a grammar. He writes in a frenzy that appears calm. He is not given to public rapture, but he trembles in private at the thought of loops that walk themselves and variables that consent to discipline. There should be cards. There should be a store. There should be a mill. The mind should hear its own footsteps and approve of their regularity. But the larger the machine, the more often the letters come from men who are experts in disdain. Money grows scarce, which is to say patience grows scarce. He is told to simplify a masterpiece into a commodity. He refuses because to simplify into that shape is to lie. He accepts that the world might prefer the lie. He decides that this is irrelevant. He becomes less charming in committees. He becomes Charles Babbage in rooms where the furniture shifts its weight uneasily. The city, sensing a man who wishes to command it, grows louder. The barrel organs arrange themselves below his windows in practice. Dogs bark. Children learn the song of his name and invent the gestures appropriate to a wizard who has not produced a rabbit. He writes pamphlets that are of a special genius, one part arithmetic, one part rage. He enumerates the damages done to a thinking man by music that does not ask permission to enter a room. It is a defense of attention disguised as a diatribe. A mind like his reaches not for a pistol, but for a policy. Perfectionism is a word that friends use, and sometimes the friend is not a friend. It is true that he cannot abide imprecision in a diagram in the same way he cannot abide an imprecise scalpel. People who die under such scalpel work are not soothed by the speed with which they die. He believes looking closely is a kind of piety. Others find in it a mania for the unforgivable. This difference becomes personal because the mechanisms of patronage and of craft are intimate. Clement, whose skill is a cathedral he can visit with his eyes closed, grows tired of being asked to carve grace out of tolerances that steel does not consider hospitable. Their parting is the sundering of two certainties. The machine, which needs both of them, suffers the quarrel without surprise. It has seen men turn from brass to pride before. He is made Lucasian professor in a way that appears to be a triumph until you look at the shape of the room he inherits. He does not lecture because his true lecture is the engine. He suspects that anyone worth teaching already understands where his real work is taking place. That is how aristocracy thinks when it refers to itself as vocation. In the evenings he attends societies, adds the weight of his name to projects that ought to exist in the world, invents a way to record the facts of a railway catastrophe so that the cause does not become a rumor, suggests the economy of decimal coinage, imagines signals at sea that tell distant watchers what they cannot see. His mind is an armada. The ships leave harbor with flags in a language his contemporaries do not yet read. He loves the city and despises it, which is to say he is married to it. He can tell you the weight of a street's noise. He can tell you how many footsteps are needed to ruin a calculation. He watches a cloud cross the square and finds in the shadow a sudden conviction that his engine will be built one day, will be built and will be ordinary as a kettle. That is both the promise and the cruelty of the work. The machine will make him unnecessary. Every man who changes the world cuts the rope on his own statue. Sometimes, late and alone, he admits to himself that misanthropy is a kind of politeness. It spares him from asking for more companionship than he can keep. He keeps company with paper that can be trusted not to forget the plan he placed upon it. He is not lovable in the ways that men who tell stories are lovable, or in the way of men who promise easy futures. He is lovable in the way a sextant is. Held in the right hands, he points true. Ruin arrives not as a single blow, but as a series of municipal inconveniences, budgets that never quite contrive to arrive, a craftsman who takes longer and charges more, rooms that must be vacated, letters unanswered because pride dictates that the answer be victorious or not at all. He loses time in the manner of a man whose currency is time. Distance grows between himself and those who would have forgiven him if only he had permitted forgiveness to be part of the design. He takes the machine apart in his mind 100 times. He remembers an early version of himself who would have accepted a less than perfect pinion because it would move the device another inch towards demonstration, and the bystanders would have seen it move and they would have understood. He cannot accept that version of himself now. To show them motion that is not the right motion is to insult the truth. He will not be an orator with a packet of tricks. He will be the man who built the mill that mills thought. Slowly and then quickly, he becomes the man who did not finish. It is astonishing how swiftly the city can agree on a certain peasant cruelty. They nod in the club and say that if he had been less, he would have been more. He recognizes the sentence as a small engine turning the crank of jealousy. He knows he is not innocent. He knows that righteousness, like gin, warms and then betrays. He drinks it anyway because what else is there? Tea and compliance. He writes a book of reflections on machines and manufactures. It is a catalogue of eyes, of what a man sees if he refuses to be lied to by habit. The factory is a geometry of motion and motive, and he enumerates it with the intimacy of anatomy. He becomes a reformer of sorts, a critic of waste, a champion of method. He argues for the economy of precision. At heart, though, the book is a love letter to the correct wheel, the perfect thread, the sovereign virtue of a system that keeps its promises. You may read it as complaint or as instruction. He intends both. His country may take its pick. It often chooses neither. In quieter passages of his life, the house breathes around him as if trying to remind him that air is still possible. He notices a mote on the wind that makes a parabola as it falls and thinks of the mill again. He imagines cards that carry commands into a room the way letters carry grief. A card with holes is a letter that declines to be misread. How gentle, that the machine can be taught by absence as well as presence. He smiles at the thought that the future will be built upon a grammar of little empty rooms through which light passes, and the passing light will be a choice made by a human mind. There is a period when Ada writes her notes like a woman writing the weather of a country she intends to visit, and he reads them with the satisfaction of a general who recognizes in a lieutenant the necessary insolence. She comes often and then not so often and then not at all, and his desk does what all desks do when they are asked to carry more memory than wood should carry. It bows and keeps its composure. He is not ruined in the way of men whose houses are sold under a tree and whose clothes are pawned by the bundle. He has means. He has books. He has a tailor who knows the difference between dignity and display. The ruin is a different kind. To have invented a verb and hear it spoken in another century. To have built a language without a mouth to speak it in. He understands that the thing he invented is the treatment for his own disease, which is the pain of believing that thinking can be made clean. One day it will be clean. It will be so clean that people will forget that thought was ever anything but a service provided instantly in a quiet room. On afternoons when he allows himself to visit a museum in his mind, he walks past a glass case where his engine has been built by men who lived after him and had the charity to spend time on an ancestor's unfinished business. He sees the metal and thinks, yes, that is what I meant. He does not think, why did I not show you this sooner? The reason not to build it then was a moral one. He is unable to reject this. It is a sternness that becomes a habit and then a fate. He sends a letter to a minister who will not read it. He drafts a paper that will not be printed. He returns to the table where a wheel waits to be adjusted in its housing. He places his small tools in a neat row because a neat row of tools is the only order the world gives him without argument. He adjusts the wheel. It turns. The sound is so modest it is a cruelty to call it triumph or tragedy. It is the sound of something agreeing at last with the drawing in which it was first conceived. He closes his eyes against the gratitude, so as not to squander it on a witnessless moment. The mania that others suspect in him, what shall he call it, is simply a refusal to end the sentence before the verb has done its work. He does not hate music, he hates interruption. He does not despise people, he despises the inattention by which they betray their own good. He is unyielding with himself and with others, and so he is loved less and needed more. He lives an old man's paradox his entire life. There is a day toward the end when the fog is honest about what it is, a soft covering for edges that never quite met. He walks the room of his mind where the analytical engine stands, all its columns in place, the mill humming with a patience that would have rescued 1,000 knights. He stands before it as if it were an altar and speaks aloud to a congregation of air. You will be built, he says, and you will be ordinary. It is perhaps the hardest admission a great man can make, that his masterpiece will, if it succeeds, recede into the furniture. The world will sit on it. It will rest its tea upon it and read a novel. It will call a cab with it and break a heart with it and make errors with it, new ones beyond his imagining. He knows this is what progress means. It is a generosity he is proud to have helped invent, even if the city in which he lives never quite grants him the courtesy of saying so. The night comes on, and with it the barrel organs, which are their own engine, a wooden cylinder spinning on pins, a hand turning a crank, a tune shaved into a mechanism like a code. He hears it and smiles despite himself. The man on the corner has made a program of his sorrow and sells it 1 penny at a time to the indifferent and the grateful. There is a kinship in that, a fellowship of crank-turners. He goes to the window and listens for a while without writing letters in his head or enumerating damages. The tune wobbles and finds itself. The fog holds it the way a mother holds a troublesome child who has finally fallen asleep. In a future he cannot see, someone stands where he stands and reads his notebooks. They know what he did and what he did not do. They breathe a different air and talk in a language he helped draft. They argue about whether the man was a monster of pride or a martyr to exactness. They argue because the engine keeps arguments alive. It reproduces them in perfect copies and sends them to the ends of the earth. The argument is itself an honor guard. If the ruin of a man is judged by what he did not give up, then his ruin was not ruin but obstinacy in the face of appetite. He did not give up the conviction that to be correct is a form of courtesy. He did not give up on a way of thinking that did not yet have a body in which to live. He gave up other things, rest, reputation, rooms that stayed warm because they were shared. But those things are, he suspects, the usual coins. He returns to the table. The neat row of small tools waits. He picks up a caliper as if it were a pen. There is, he realizes, one last pleasure left to him that the world cannot take away, to place the points of an instrument around a small truth and feel them close with a click that is identical to gratitude. He bends, measures, adjusts, and measures again. The city thinks around him with all its old noise, and for once it does not matter. He has built within himself an engine that takes the racket of the world and removes the error from it. And for a moment, there in the dim room where the past refused to die, the future returns the favor. He rests the tool. He speaks to the absent machine as a man speaks to a friend he has not seen in years, by using the present tense. "You are beautiful," he says, and the city, having thought as much as it is inclined to think, grows quiet enough to agree. He steps back. He lays the paper flat. Somewhere a child pulls a card through a toy and watches a figure dance. Somewhere a clerk transcribes, brilliantly wrong, the third digit after the decimal and writes a fate without knowing it. Somewhere a woman with eyes like a new kind of night writes the word algorithm in a note and does not call it that and closes her book and goes downstairs. Somewhere a train eats the horizon and does not know that a man in a London room designed a way to make its schedules less murderous. He is not happy, not in the way a man who has finished is happy. He is content the way a man is content who has built a road to a country he will not visit. He feels the satisfaction of an engineer, the satisfaction that does not require applause because the wheel either turns or it does not, and this one, at least, turns. He feels the sadness of an artist, the sadness that comes from having designed a violin and never once hearing it sing. He feels both and does not make a hierarchy of them. He allows them to share the bench. The fog thickens. The tune outside resolves into silence. He picks up the lamp and lifts it closer to the drawing. Light passes through the paper where the pinholes are, those tiny absences that mark the places where decisions were made and then made again. It is a good map, he thinks. It will do. At the end he lies in a bed that is not quite his, in a world that is not quite ready, and thinks of cards with holes and mills with patience, and a woman who understood the poetry of a machine and a boy at Cambridge who thought Europe had better calculus because it had better verbs. He smiles a little at the thought. He closes his eyes and hears, in the quiet that becomes finally benevolent, the sound a gear makes when it is exactly itself, a small, polite consent. If ruin followed him to the door, it does not enter the room. The door is shut. The engine, which is to say the idea, sits up all night beside him keeping a tidy watch. In the morning the city thinks again. Its thinking is a little cleaner, though no one can say why. A clerk copies a number correctly and a ship finds the harbor in fog. A child asks her father what a table is and is told something useful. A young man turns a crank and imagines that behind the crank is another crank, and behind that a logic that does not require cranks at all. In laboratories and parlors and alleys, methods gather themselves. The world did not wait, exactly. It simply took the longest possible breath. Charles Babbage, who hated noise, has become a silence into which future voices speak. They will be loud enough for him. They will be exact enough for him. They will be ordinary, which is to say triumphant. And let's explore the tragic life of Nikola Tesla. In the village of Smiljan, where the Lika River carved its indifferent path through the Austrian Empire's borderlands, a storm broke on the night of July 9, 1856, or perhaps the 10th, depending on the midwife's weary clock. Lightning clawed the sky like a beast demanding entry, and amid the thunder's roar, Nikola Tesla entered the world. His mother, Juka, a woman of unlettered ingenuity who mended machines with the same grace she spun wool, claimed the tempest marked him as a child of electricity. His father, Milutin, an Orthodox priest whose sermons wove scripture with the logic of Euclid, saw only a fragile boy with fever-bright eyes. From the cradle, Nikola's mind hummed with visions, flashes of mechanisms unseen, numbers that danced like fireflies in the dark. He would later say his inventions came not from labor, but from a sudden illumination, as if the universe whispered its secrets through the veil of sleep. Childhood in Smiljan was a fragile idol shattered by loss. At 5, Nikola watched his older brother Dane die in a riding accident, a tragedy that etched guilt into his soul. He would forever wonder if his own wild imagination had summoned the horse's frenzy. The family moved to Gospic, where young Nikola devoured books on science, his eidetic memory capturing pages whole. Bugs fascinated him, their intricate legs a blueprint for gears he could not yet build. But illness struck. Cholera twice nearly claimed him, leaving a body frail and a mind sharpened to a blade's edge. He attributed his survival to a vow of celibacy, a promise to a saint that bound him to his visions rather than flesh. In those fevered beds, numbers became companions, safer than the world's cruelties. By 12, in the gymnasium at Gospic, Tesla's genius flickered. He solved geometry problems in his head, visualizing cubes unfolding like flowers. But melancholy shadowed him. He wept over multiplied volumes, as if the act betrayed some deeper unity. At 17, in Karlovac, he built a water wheel powered by the river's flow, its paddles turning with hypnotic precision. Gambling tempted him, cards and billiards lost to his calculations, but he swore off it after a binge, channeling the thrill into engineering dreams. In 1875, he enrolled at the Austrian Polytechnic in Graz, where a professor's Graham dynamo sparked revelation. Watching it spin as both motor and generator, Tesla envisioned alternating current AC as the future, not the direct current DC that choked Edison's wires. But academia chafed. He dropped out, burdened by his father's death in 1879 and his own mounting debts. Europe called next. In 1881 in Budapest, Tesla worked for the Central Telegraph Office, sketching his induction motor on a napkin during a park stroll. The rotating magnetic field appeared to him fully formed, a vision so vivid he clutched a friend's shoulder for balance. "I've got it," he cried, though the friend saw only a madman's scribble. In Paris, for Edison's Continental Company, he improved dynamos, once repairing a broken one in a night to save a ship's voyage. His ingenuity earned praise, but pay was meager. In 1882, in Strasbourg, he constructed his first AC motor prototype, its hum a prophecy of power untethered from wires. Yet funding evaporated. A backer's betrayal left him penniless, wandering Budapest's cafes with inventions in his pockets and hunger in his gut. America beckoned in 1884, a land of electric promise. Tesla arrived in New York with 4 cents, a poem by Goethe and designs for a flying machine, visions too vast for his suitcase. He sought Thomas Edison, the wizard of Menlo Park, armed with a letter praising his meritorious service. Edison hired him to fix DC generators on the Oregon, paying $18 a week. Tesla toiled nights, sleeping on workbenches, his mind alight with improvements. When he solved a dynamo flaw, Edison laughed. "Tesla, You don't understand our American humor. The promised $50,000 bonus vanished like smoke. Betrayed, Tesla quit in 1885, vowing his own path. He dug ditches for $2 a day in Edison's shadow, mud caking his dreams, until Alfred Brown and Charles Peck funded the Tesla Electric Light Company in 1886. The arc lamp followed, a brilliant but flickering invention that lit New York streets but burned through capital. Investors demanded dividends. Tesla, lost in motors, refused. The company dissolved in 1887, leaving him homeless, sleeping in labs or parks. Ruin's first taste was bitter, genius mocked by ledgers. Yet from this nadir rose triumph. In 1887, at an AIEE lecture, Tesla demonstrated his AC induction motor. Its polyphase system, motors, transformers, dynamos, promised efficient, long-distance power. George Westinghouse bought the patents for $60,000 plus royalties, igniting the war of currents. Edison, defender of DC, smeared AC as deadly. He electrocuted animals publicly, whispering of Tesla's death ray dangers. Tesla countered with science. AC powered Niagara Falls in 1895, illuminating Buffalo without loss. The world shifted. Westinghouse's bid won the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, where Tesla's currents lit 1,000,000 bulbs in a cascade of light. Fame bloomed in 1891 with the Tesla coil, a resonant transformer birthing high-voltage arcs that danced like captive lightning. He became a naturalized citizen, lecturing across Europe, London, Paris, even Zagreb, where crowds hailed their prodigal son. But glory cracked under personal storms. His mother died in 1892. Tesla, en route to her bedside, arrived too late, collapsing in grief. Visions intensified. At 30, he claimed flashes of light-birthing inventions. By 40, they bordered hallucination. OCD gripped him. Obsessed with multiples of 3, he circled blocks thrice before entering. Germs terrified him. He avoided handshakes, washing obsessively. Pigeons became confidants. He fed them in parks, claiming one white dove carried his soul's messages. The 1890s marked zenith and descent. In his Houston Street lab, Tesla generated artificial lightning, X-rays before Röntgen, radio waves before Marconi. He predicted wireless communication, remote control, demonstrating a radio boat in Madison Square Garden in 1898, alarming crowds who thought it demonic. Yet finances frayed. Royalties from Westinghouse, once a fortune, were renounced in 1897 to save the company from bankruptcy, leaving Tesla penniless. He burned Westinghouse's check, a quixotic gesture that sealed his isolation. Europe offered honors, a doctorate from Yale, fellowship in the Royal Society, but America, his chosen forge, turned indifferent. Colorado Springs in 1899 was exile and ecstasy. Funded by John Jacob Astor, Tesla built a lab amid Pikes Peak's pines, chasing cosmic rays. His magnifying transmitter hurled 135-foot bolts, shaking the earth. He photographed ball lightning, detected extraterrestrial signals, claiming Martian messages in the ether. "The universe is a symphony," he wrote, but isolation bred paranoia. Earthquakes from his experiments drew officials. Locals whispered of the mad foreigner summoning storms. Visions peaked. He saw machines in flames, heard whispers from the void. Returning to New York, he announced free wireless power, a utopia where energy flowed like air. J.P. Morgan funded Wardenclyffe Tower in 1901, a 187-foot spire on Long Island, meant to broadcast power and messages globally. Wardenclyffe was Tesla's cathedral, his folly. Groundbreaking drew crowds. He envisioned it piercing the ionosphere, ending wars with teleforce beams. But Morgan withdrew in 1903, demanding profit, not poetry. Begging letters to Astor, Carnegie, rejections piled like snow. The tower stood skeletal, a ruin mocking the skyline. Foreclosure loomed. In 1917, it was dynamited for scrap, Tesla watching from afar, heart fracturing. "The tower will be my grave," he murmured. Madness deepened. He spoke to Edison in dreams, accused rivals of theft. Marconi's Nobel in 1909 for radio, built on Tesla's patents, stung like betrayal. He sued in 1915, but courts favored the practical Italian. The 1910s blurred into penury. Tesla lived in hotels, the Waldorf Astoria, then cheaper dives fed by old friends' charity. Inventions flowed, bladeless turbines, speedometers, but patents yielded nothing. World War I isolated him. His death ray teleforce, a particle beam to end conflict, drew government interest but no funds. He predicted radar neon lights but voiced them to empty rooms. Pigeons ruled his world. In St. Regis Hotel, he nursed injured birds, claiming one dove's death in 1922 took his life's spark. "She was my love," he said, eyes vacant. OCD rituals consumed him. Napkins folded in threes, hotel rooms in multiples of three. He avoided women's touch, pearls evoking serpents, milk triggering childhood revulsions. Failure's ruin was total by the 1920s. Debts mounted. He owed hotels fortunes, dodging creditors with charm or evasion. Birthdays brought telegrams Eisenhower, Gandhi, but isolation gnawed. In 1928, he patented a vertical takeoff plane unseen. Lectures dwindled, audiences dwindled to cranks and admirers. He wrote My Inventions in 1919, a manifesto of visions, wireless globe girdling, human energy harnessing. But publishers balked at the eccentric prose. "The present is theirs, the future for which I really worked is mine," he declared, prophetic yet pathetic. The Great Depression amplified his fall. In the New Yorker hotel from 1933, Tesla lived on credit, room 3327 his fortress. He celebrated his 80th in 1936 with a banquet, but guests were few, Sarnoff, Pupin, while fame eluded. He touted earthquake machines, death rays to deter Hitler, but skeptics scoffed. Pneumonia in 1937 weakened him. A taxicab hit him, fracturing ribs, yet he walked on, defiant. Pigeons remained. He spent last pennies on feed, conversing in whispers. "I have decided to dedicate my whole life to fighting evil," he told a reporter, but evil was entropy, the world's forgetfulness. January 7, 1943, found him alone in room 3327, 86 years etched in frailty. Heart failure claimed him at 10:45 p.m., the world at war, blind to its lost seer. FBI agents seized papers, trunks of diagrams, fearing weapon secrets. Charlotte Musar, a niece, mourned the uncle who sent pigeon photos from America. Funeral drew thousands. Shillard eulogized the man who lit the world yet died in shadow. Wardenclyffe's ghost loomed. His body cremated, ashes in a sphere, a nod to his cosmic dreams. Tesla's ruin was no accident but the price of unyielding vision. Born in lightning, he chased it to madness. Hallucinations birthing brilliance, phobias guarding fragility. Edison's DC won battles, Tesla's AC the war, powering empires yet yielding him poverty. Westinghouse's salvation became his renunciation. Wardenclyffe, his Babel, crumbled under commerce's weight. He spoke to birds because humans betrayed, stealing patents, mocking celibate purity. In failure, he triumphed. Radio, X-rays, remote control traced to his coils. But ruin defined him, the genius penniless feeding strays while the world wired itself on his forgotten currents. "The day science begins to study non-physical phenomena," he said, "it will make more progress in one decade than in all previous centuries." His life proved the cost. Illumination demands sacrifice, and Tesla paid in solitude's storm. And of course, there was Charles Goodyear. In the shadow of New Haven steeples, where the air carried the tang of salt from Long Island Sound and the promise of Yankee ingenuity, Charles Goodyear entered the world on December 29, 1800, the firstborn son of Amasa Goodyear, a hardware merchant whose modest inventions, spring-loaded plows and clever door locks, hinted at a legacy of tinkering that would both inspire and curse his progeny. Amasa's shop on Chapel Street was a boy's paradise of gears and gadgets, but it was also a school of scarcity. The family scraped by, teaching young Charles that innovation was not a path to wealth but a desperate bid against poverty's tide. By his teens, Charles apprenticed under his father, his hands calloused from forging nails and filing edges, his mind already wandering to mechanisms that could outlast the whims of weather and markets. Formal schooling at the Episcopal Academy ended early, leaving him to devour practical knowledge from the forge and the ledger, where he learned that failure was the true teacher, patient and unforgiving. Philadelphia called in 1821, a bustling hub of trade where Charles joined his father's expanding business, stocking shelves with tools and dreaming of patents that might secure the family's future. The Panic of 1830 struck like a thunderclap, however, collapsing banks and burying the Goodyears in debt. Charles, at 29, watched his father's empire crumble, the store padlocked while creditors circled like vultures. Imprisoned for 3 months in the Moyamensing debtors' prison, a dank cell block where the walls wept moisture and the air reeked of despair, he turned inward, his first experiments with rubber born not of ambition but necessity. Gum elastic, cheap and plentiful from South American imports, was his unlikely muse. Heating it in his hands and kneading in magnesia, he created a white, less sticky compound that hinted at potential, a fleeting victory in the gloom of incarceration. Released but scarred, Charles vowed to conquer rubber's flaws, its tendency to melt in summer's heat and shatter in winter's grip, seeing in it not just a material but a salvation for his family's fortunes. The Roxbury India Rubber Company in Boston became his unlikely patron in 1834, their factory a chaotic symphony of presses and molds producing galoshes, valves, and life preservers from the exotic gum. Goodyear's improved valve for life vests, a simple design that prevented leaks, earned him a contract, but it was the manager's offhand remark that ignited his obsession. Invent a better rubber, not just a better valve. Back in New Haven, he transformed his wife's kitchen into a laboratory, pots simmering with latex mixtures while children played amid the acrid fumes. His first trials were crude, trial-and-error alchemy, mixing rubber with sand for texture, ink for color, even castor oil and witch hazel in hopes of stabilization, each batch kneaded by hand until his palms blistered. Magnesia and quicklime yielded a smooth, flexible compound that seemed promising. In 1835, he displayed small items, purses and aprons, at the New York American Institute Fair, where judges praised the non-sticky innovation, awarding him a silver medal that felt like the first crack in rubber's armor. But triumph soured swiftly. The U.S. Post Office contracted him in 1836 for waterproof mail bags, a boon that should have steadied his finances. 150 bags shipped to Boston, lightweight and impermeable, only to return months later as molten messes after a heat wave, their contents fused in a sticky ruin. Creditors pounced anew, dragging him back to prison in Philadelphia, where, undaunted, he continued experiments in his cell, smuggling gum past guards and boiling it over a smuggled lamp. The humiliation burned deeper than the acids he handled. Letters to investors begged for funds, promising that one more trial would unlock rubber's secret, yet each failure deepened the family's despair. Clarissa, his steadfast wife, pawning heirlooms to feed their 6 children. In 1837, relocating to New York, Goodyear rented a garret overlooking the East River, its drafts carrying the harbor's brine as he escalated his trials. Nitric acid baths that smoothed the surface but left the core vulnerable, lime soaks that hardened edges unevenly. Woburn, Massachusetts, offered a fragile alliance in 1839 with the Eagle India Rubber Company, a firm teetering on collapse from the same rubber woes that plagued the industry. There, amid the clatter of malfunctioning presses, Goodyear met Nathaniel Hayward, a tanner whose solarization process, drying sulfur-treated rubber in the sun, provided a crucial clue. Exchanging secrets for a modest fee, they produced what seemed durable, shoes and hoses that withstood initial tests, but winter's freeze cracked them like glass, and summer's swelter softened them anew. Debts mounted to $20,000. The company folded, leaving Goodyear evicted and experimenting in his Woburn kitchen, where poverty forced him to sell his children's school books for sulfur. One frigid evening in early 1839, Amid a heated family argument, a sulfur rubber strip slipped from the table onto the hot stove. It charred like leather rather than melting, retaining elasticity when cooled overnight in the biting air. The accidental eureka, vulcanization spark, electrified him. He replicated it frantically, varying heat levels from teakettle steam to oven blasts, noting how precise temperatures, around 270 degrees F, bonded sulfur atoms to rubber's chains, creating a resilient polymer. Perfection eluded him for 5 grueling years. Returning to Naugatuck in 1840, Goodyear built a crude factory, pressure-steaming batches in iron retorts jury-rigged from hardware scraps, each trial a gamble against explosion or contamination. Early vulcanizates were inconsistent, too brittle if overcooked, too soft if underdone, demanding endless iterations. Adding lead oxides for color, zinc for stability, all while inhaling toxic vapors that scarred his lungs and yellowed his skin. Investors trickled in, lured by demonstrations of vulcanized lifebelts that floated unyielding in icy waters, but skepticism reigned. One backer, after seeing a batch warp in a heat test, withdrew $5,000, plunging the family into starvation rations. Clarissa's pleas for moderation fell on deaf ears. Charles, eyes wild with vision, worked through nights, convinced that rubber's molecular puzzle was the key to industrial utopia: tires for carriages, seals for engines, fabrics for the masses. A partial success in 1841, vulcanized piano keys for a New York manufacturer, brought brief relief, but scaling production revealed flaws. Uneven curing led to batches that cracked under pressure, eroding trust. The patent fight ignited on June 15, 1844, when U.S. Patent number 3633 was granted for improvement in India rubber fabrics, describing the vulcanization process as subjecting rubber to sulfur and mineral ingredients under heat, yielding a product permanently elastic. This document, penned in exhaustive detail from years of notebooks stained with latex and acid, was Goodyear's fortress, but one built on sand, as rivals swarmed like locusts to the ripening fields of rubber commerce. From bootmakers in Lynn, Massachusetts, to hose manufacturers in Philadelphia, infringers pirated the formula, churning out galoshes and belts that bore the Goodyear name without a cent to its inventor, flooding markets and undercutting his meager licensing fees. The first salvos came swiftly. By late 1844, Goodyear filed his initial suits against small operators like the Boston Rubber Company, alleging they replicated his sulfur heat method to produce waterproof clothing, evidence gleaned from seized factory scraps showing identical charring patterns. These early cases, heard in federal circuit courts, were skirmishes of attrition. Witnesses testified to the uniqueness of vulcanized elasticity, but juries, swayed by tales of prior art from South American natives chewing gum with sulfur, often deadlocked, forcing settlements that yielded pennies on the dollar. By 1845, the floodgates burst. Over a dozen New England firms openly defied the patent, claiming Hancock's British process, independently discovered after examining a smuggled Goodyear sample, proved vulcanization was no secret but a natural evolution. Goodyear, borrowing against future royalties, hired lawyers to raid factories, confiscating machines and compounds for analysis. One raid in Providence uncovered vats bubbling with sulfur mixes mirroring his specifications, leading to Goodyear v. Providence Rubber Company, a precursor to greater battles. The Circuit Court in Rhode Island, under Justice Nathan Clifford, ruled infringement in 1846, enjoining sales but awarding nominal damages, as defendants argued their license from an early collaborator covered japanned cloths, not full vulcanization, a narrow interpretation that left Goodyear's coffers empty and his resolve hardened. Appeals dragged into 1847, with Goodyear personally testifying, his hands scarred from trials, describing the accidental spill that birthed the process, countering claims of obviousness with demonstrations where untreated rubber melted under a flame while vulcanized withstood it unscathed. Victory came, but at $2,000 in fees. It was a hollow triumph, forcing him to surrender the patent in 1849 for reissue, broadening claims to encompass any vulcanizable gum under heat and sulfur, a desperate bid to stem the tide. The apex of Goodyear's legal odyssey unfolded in 1852 with what newspapers dubbed the Great India Rubber Case, a consolidated mega-trial in New York federal court pitting Goodyear against 30 defendants, from hose makers to carriage fabricators, accused of infringing his reissued patents. This marathon, spanning months, drew crowds rivaling theater premieres. Goodyear, gaunt and fervent, took the stand for days, cross-examining rivals who admitted using sulfur heat but claimed it was public domain from Hancock's 1843 patent. Prosecutors paraded experts, chemists from Yale, who dissected samples, proving vulcanized rubber's molecular crosslinks unique to Goodyear's formula, while defense witnesses invoked ancient Mayan techniques, dismissed as folklore without evidence. The stakes soared. Defendants had flooded the market with $500,000 in goods, from army ponchos to surgical tubing, all profiting from Goodyear's toil. Judge Samuel Nelson presided, his rulings favoring Goodyear on novelty but scrutinizing the reissue's breadth, ultimately awarding $100,000 in damages, a windfall that headlines blared as justice, yet legal costs halved it before ink dried. The verdict set precedent, affirming process and product patents as distinct, but infringers appealed, prolonging the agony into 1853 with briefs piling like unpaid bills. Parallel battles raged abroad. In 1851, at London's Crystal Palace exhibition, Goodyear's vulcanized pavilion, featuring fireproof curtains and elastic statues, earned acclaim, but Hancock's adjacent display sparked envy. By 1852, as Goodyear toured Europe licensing the process, British firms like Stephen Moulton challenged his priority, filing oppositions to his patent application. The 1855 trial in London's Chancery Court became a transatlantic farce. Goodyear, arriving mid-proceedings, testified that his samples sent in 1842 were sealed secrets. But chemists for Hancock argued reverse engineering was feasible, citing sulfur blooms as clues. Moulton, a Welsh pioneer, admitted examining Goodyear's rubber but denied copying, producing logs of his own sulfur trials from 1840. The judge ruled for Hancock, invalidating Goodyear's British claim and denying royalties, a blow that left him jailed in Paris for debts incurred chasing the case. From his cell, Goodyear penned appeals to Parliament, decrying piracy across the seas. But the verdict stood, fueling American suits where defendants cited the UK loss as proof of invalidity. No suit embodied the ruinous grind like Goodyear v. Day in 1855, a Boston Circuit Court epic against Horace H. Day, a New York rubber magnate who had built an empire on infringed vulcanization, producing belts and packings worth millions. Day, a shrewd operator, flooded markets with Day's patent rubber, claiming prior art from his 1836 experiments with turpentine and lime, processes Goodyear debunked as failures that left rubber tacky, unlike his sulfur breakthrough. Hiring Daniel Webster, the silver-tongued senator whose fees reached $10,000, the era's largest, Day's defense thundered for 2 days. Goodyear seeks to monopolize the gum of the gods, arguing the patent's reissue fraudulently expanded claims, encompassing all gums beyond India rubber. Goodyear countered with Nathaniel Hayward as witness, detailing the 1839 spill and subsequent refinements, while Lab Demos showed Day's products identical in elasticity and heat resistance. The jury, awed by Webster's eloquence but swayed by Goodyear's evidence, hung after 3 ballots, forcing a mistrial and retrial in 1856 that dragged into 1858. Appeals to the Supreme Court loomed, but Goodyear, health failing, settled for $20,000, enough for bread, not balm, while Day's firm rebranded, skirting injunctions with minor tweaks. The post-1855 deluge saw over 200 suits by 1859, from Goodyear v. Colburn, 1847, Rhode Island, enjoining shoe production after proving sulfur ratios matched, to Rubber Company v. Goodyear, 1869, Supreme Court, posthumous victory affirming reissues against Providence's Army goods infringement. In the latter, Justice Clifford, now on the High Court, upheld the 1849 and 1860 reissues, ruling process and product independent, awarding executors injunctions and profits. But years after Goodyear's death, the $50,000 haul went to heirs amid contested licenses. Defendants invoked Chaffee's 1846 license, a narrow grant for variegated cloths, but courts voided it as non-transferable, yet delays bankrupted Goodyear, who pawned Clarissa's jewels for court fees. French suits in 1855, amid his imprisonment, targeted Rivette's copies, yielding a Pyrrhic win but $15,000 in costs. He lectured from jail on 500 applications, from dentures to balloons, visions unrealized. These lawsuits, a labyrinth of over 230 cases from 1844 to 1860, devoured Goodyear's life, fees eclipsing $200,000 in royalties, turning triumph to torment. Chronic illness from fumes worsened in court stress. Breakdowns left him pacing hotel rooms, ranting of conspiracies, alienating allies like Hayward who quietly profited. Clarissa endured evictions, children schooled on charity. One son died young amid the chaos. By 1858, patent extension to 1868 offered hope, but infringers like the New York Rubber Company persisted. Their 1859 suit reversed on appeal but draining final reserves. Death on July 1, 1860, in New York's Metropolitan Hotel at 59 ended the fray. Buried unmarked in Grove Street Cemetery, his trials forged an industry, Naugatuck's Rubber Valley, Goodyear Tire in 1898, worth billions, yet his ruin a cautionary forge. Genius litigated into oblivion. Clarissa claimed pensions. Heirs won posthumous cases, but Charles's shadow lingers in court annals as invention's unyielding adversary.